Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her small Texas town. At 32, she worked as a librarian, lived alone with her two cats, and spent most evenings reading mystery novels on her worn couch. The townspeople knew her as the woman who never missed church on Sundays, always brought homemade cookies to community events, and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. She was predictable, safe, and utterly ordinary in their eyes. When Sarah announced she was joining the Army Reserve, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. Her mother cried for 3 days straight. Her best friend Lisa laughed, thinking it was a joke. Even Pastor Williams pulled her aside after service, gently suggesting that perhaps she should reconsider such a drastic decision. The general consensus was clear. Sarah was too soft, too gentle, too much of a simple woman for military life. The whispers followed her everywhere. At the grocery store, people wondered aloud how someone who got teary-eyed during Disney movies could possibly handle basic training. At the post office, they questioned whether she understood what she was signing up for. The local coffee shop became a hub of speculation about how long she would last before coming home with her tail between her legs. Sarah's decision hadn't come from nowhere, though few bothered to ask about her reasons. Her grandfather had served in World War II, and his stories of courage and sacrifice had planted seeds in her young mind. After his death the previous year, she found his old uniform and medals tucked away in the attic. Holding his Purple Heart, she felt a calling she couldn't explain to anyone, especially not to people who saw her as nothing more than a quiet librarian. The doubts weren't just external. Sarah stared at herself in the mirror each morning, wondering if everyone else was right. She had never been athletic, never raised her voice in anger, never even killed a spider without feeling guilty. How could someone like her possibly succeed in an environment designed to break people down and build them back up as warriors? Her family's concern was genuine but patronizing. During Sunday dinners, her uncle would shake his head and mutter about how the military wasn't a place for girls like Sarah. Her cousins offered to talk her out of it, suggesting she volunteer at the animal shelter instead if she wanted to make a difference. Even her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, patted her hand sympathetically and said she was sure Sarah would find her way back to her proper place soon enough. The town's reaction revealed their narrow view of who could be a hero. They could accept men returning from service as changed, stronger versions of themselves. But Sarah? She was supposed to remain exactly as she had always been. Helpful, quiet, and safely contained within the boundaries they had drawn for her. The idea that she might transform into something unexpected threatened their comfortable understanding of who she was. As her departure date approached, the comments became more pointed. People began making bets about how long she would last. Some gave her 2 weeks. Others were more generous with a month. The barbershop regulars joked that she would probably faint during her first day of physical training. The irony was lost on them that their lack of faith only strengthened her resolve. Sarah began her own quiet preparation. She started running before dawn when the streets were empty, not wanting to give the town gossips more ammunition. She researched military history, studied maps of current conflict zones, and read every book she could find about modern warfare. While everyone else saw her as naive and unprepared, she was methodically preparing herself for a challenge she knew would test every fiber of her being. The night before leaving for basic training, Sarah sat in her small living room, surrounded by boxes of belongings she was storing away. Her cat seemed to sense the change, staying close to her side. She thought about all the people who believed she would fail, and for a moment their doubts crept into her heart. But then she remembered her grandfather's words about courage not being the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Her phone buzzed with final messages from well-meaning friends and family. Most wished her luck while subtly suggesting she could always come home if things got too difficult. A few were more direct, asking if she was absolutely sure about this decision. Sarah turned off her phone and sat in the silence, knowing that tomorrow would begin a journey that would either prove everyone right about her limitations or show them a side of herself that even she didn't know existed. Basic training hit Sarah like a physical blow. The first week was a blur of shouting drill sergeants, pre-dawn runs, and physical challenges that left her body screaming in protest. While other recruits had prepared for months, building muscle and endurance, Sarah arrived with the soft physique of someone whose biggest physical challenge was reaching the top shelf at the library. Drill. Sergeant Morrison took one look at Sarah on the first day and immediately labeled her as a problem. Her small frame, quiet demeanor and obvious struggle with the initial fitness tests marked her as someone who wouldn't make it through the program. He wasn't cruel, but his attention was clearly focused on the recruits he believed had potential. Sarah found herself largely ignored, which was somehow worse than being yelled at. The other recruits were a mix of young athletes, former gang members seeking a new path, and college graduates looking for direction. Sarah stood out not just for her age and background, but for her complete lack of bravado. While others boasted about their capabilities or complained loudly about the difficult conditions, Sarah quietly endured, taking mental notes and refusing to quit despite her body's protests. Night after night, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk, muscles aching and doubt gnawing at her confidence. Her bunkmate, Jessica, was a 19-year-old former high school track star who could run circles around most of the male recruits. Jessica watched Sarah struggle through each day with a mixture of pity and confusion, unable to understand why someone so obviously unprepared would put herself through this ordeal. The first real test came during the obstacle course. Sarah watched recruit after recruit navigate the challenges with varying degrees of success, but all of them managed to complete the course within the time limit. When her turn came, she approached the first obstacle with determination that quickly turned to panic. The rope climb that others conquered in seconds left her hanging helplessly, arms shaking with effort. Laughter rippled through the group of waiting recruits. Not malicious, but the kind of nervous laughter that comes when people witness someone failing spectacularly at something that should be manageable. Sarah heard someone whisper that she would probably quit by evening. Another voice suggested she should have stayed home with her books. The comments stung because they echoed her own fears. Drill Sergeant Morrison's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight shake of his head. She was becoming exactly what he had predicted, a liability, someone who would slow down the entire unit and potentially put others at risk in real combat situations. The disappointment in his eyes was more crushing than any shouted criticism could have been. That evening, Sarah called home for the first time since arriving. Her mother's voice was filled with concern and barely concealed hope that Sarah would admit this had all been a mistake. Her friend Lisa was more direct, asking if she was ready to come home and return to her normal life. Even Pastor Williams, who happened to be visiting when she called, got on the phone to remind her that there was no shame in recognizing when something wasn't meant to be. But something unexpected happened during that conversation. As her family and friends offered her easy exits and gentle reassurances that she had tried her best, Sarah felt a spark of defiance. Their low expectations meant to comfort her, instead reminded her of why she had left in the first place. She was tired of being seen as fragile, tired of being protected from challenges, tired of being defined by other people's limited vision of what she could accomplish. The next morning brought another obstacle course session. This time Sarah approached it differently. Instead of trying to match the speed and strength of her fellow recruits, she focused on technique and persistence. She studied how others climbed the rope, noting the way they used their legs to assist their arms. She watched the efficient movements of those who excelled at the balance beam and wall climb. Her second attempt was still slower than everyone else's, but she completed every obstacle. The improvement was modest but undeniable. A few recruits nodded approvingly, and Jessica offered an encouraging word. Most importantly, Drill Sergeant Morrison made eye contact with her as she crossed the finish line, and for the first time, she saw something other than disappointment in his expression. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Sarah would struggle with each new challenge, often performing worse than her peers initially. But while others might master something quickly and then coast, Sarah would analyze, adapt, and gradually improve. Her progress was methodical and determined, earning her a quiet respect from some of her fellow recruits, who began to see that her persistence was its own form of strength. By the halfway point of basic training, Sarah had earned a nickname, the Turtle. It wasn't meant as an insult, but rather as recognition of her steady, unstoppable progress. She might not be the fastest or strongest, but she had proven that she wouldn't quit, no matter how difficult things became. This quiet reliability was beginning to catch the attention of instructors who valued mental toughness over natural athletic ability. The transformation began subtly. Sarah's body adapted to the demands of military training, developing muscle where there had been softness and endurance where there had been weakness. But the more significant change was mental. The quiet librarian who had arrived at basic training was evolving into someone harder, more focused, and surprisingly resilient under pressure. Drill Sergeant Morrison began to notice Sarah during tactical exercises. While other recruits might panic under simulated combat conditions or forget their training when stressed, Sarah remained calm and methodical. Her years of organizing information and solving complex problems at the library translated surprisingly well to military strategy and quick decision-making under pressure. The turning point came during a night navigation exercise. Teams of 4 recruits were dropped in unfamiliar terrain with only a map, compass, and radio, tasked with reaching a designated checkpoint within 6 hours. Sarah's team consisted of herself, Marcus, a former college football player, Tony, an ex-mechanic from Detroit, and Amanda, a competitive shooter from rural Montana. Initially, Marcus assumed leadership of the group, confident in his physical capabilities and natural charisma. But as the hours passed and the team became increasingly lost in the dense forest, frustration began to mount. The terrain was more challenging than expected, and Marcus's aggressive pace was exhausting the group without bringing them closer to their objective. Sarah had been quietly studying the map, while the others argued about which direction to take. She noticed discrepancies between the compass readings and the terrain features they were encountering. While Marcus insisted they push forward faster, Sarah suggested they stop and reassess their position. When he dismissed her concerns, she calmly pointed out that they had been walking in a large circle for the past 2 hours. The revelation that Sarah was right forced the team to reconsider who should be making decisions. Amanda, who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's military capabilities, found herself impressed by the older woman's analytical approach to problem-solving. Tony, practical by nature, recognized that Sarah's methodical style might be exactly what they needed to succeed. Sarah took point for the remainder of the exercise, using her research skills to carefully match terrain features with map symbols. She set a sustainable pace that kept the team moving efficiently without exhausting their energy reserves. Most importantly, she maintained constant communication with each team member, ensuring that everyone understood the plan and felt valued for their contributions. They reached the checkpoint with 40 minutes to spare, making them one of only 3 teams to complete the exercise within the time limit. More significantly, they arrived as a cohesive unit while other teams straggled in with members exhausted, angry, or completely separated from their groups. The exercise that was supposed to test navigation skills had actually revealed leadership potential that none of the instructors had expected from the quiet former librarian. Word of Sarah's performance spread quickly through the training company. Drill Sergeant Morrison pulled her aside after morning formation to discuss her unexpected display of leadership. He admitted that he had initially written her off as someone who would either quit or barely scrape through training. Instead, she was proving to have qualities that couldn't be taught: mental toughness, analytical thinking, and the ability to inspire confidence in others. The recognition brought new challenges. Some recruits who had previously ignored or patronized Sarah now sought her advice on everything from tactical problems to personal issues. Others resented her sudden prominence, particularly those who had assumed they were destined for leadership roles based on their physical capabilities or previous military family connections. Sarah found herself walking a delicate line between stepping up when her skills were needed and not alienating fellow recruits, who might see her success as a threat to their own advancement. Her natural inclination toward diplomacy served her well, as she learned to share credit for successes while taking responsibility for failures, gradually earning the genuine respect of her peers. The most significant validation came during combat simulation exercises. Sarah's calm demeanor under pressure and ability to process information quickly made her invaluable during chaotic scenarios. She had an uncanny ability to spot details that others missed and to synthesize multiple sources of information into actionable intelligence. During one particularly intense urban warfare simulation, Sarah identified an ambush that other team members had missed, potentially saving several lives in the exercise. Her warning came not from superior eyesight or combat instincts, but from her habit of systematically analyzing her environment and noticing when something didn't fit the expected. Pattern instructors began using Sarah's performance as an example of how different types of intelligence and life experience could translate into military effectiveness. Her success challenged assumptions about what made a good soldier and forced everyone, including Sarah herself, to reconsider the value of quiet determination over flashy heroics. As basic training entered its final phase, Sarah had become something none of them had expected, a respected leader whose opinions were sought and valued. The transformation wasn't just physical, though her body had certainly adapted to military demands. The more profound change was in how she saw herself and how others saw her. The simple woman from Texas was discovering capabilities she never knew existed. Graduation from basic training marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Sarah returned home for a brief leave, transformed in ways that left her hometown struggling to recognize the woman who had left them months earlier. The physical changes were obvious. She stood straighter, moved with purpose, and carried herself with a confidence that had never been there before. The reaction from her community was mixed and complicated. Some people were genuinely proud of her accomplishment, impressed that she had proven their doubts wrong. Others seemed almost disappointed that their predictions of failure hadn't come true. There was an uncomfortable undercurrent of resentment from those who had been so certain she would quit and return to her predictable life. Sarah's mother fussed over her constantly, alternating between pride in her daughter's achievement and worry about what came next. She had hoped that completing basic training would satisfy whatever need had driven Sarah to join the military in the first place. The possibility that this was just the beginning of a longer journey filled her with anxiety she struggled to hide. At the library where Sarah had worked, her former colleagues treated her like a celebrity, asking endless questions about military life and marveling at her transformation. But there was also an underlying expectation that she would eventually return to her old job, as if her military service was just an extended vacation from her real life. The assumption that she would want to go back to her previous existence felt suffocating. During a community barbecue, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who wanted to hear war stories, despite the fact that she hadn't been deployed anywhere more dangerous than a training base in Georgia. Their fascination with military life was surface level, focused on excitement and adventure, rather than the deeper transformation she had experienced. She realized that most of them still saw her as the same person playing dress-up in a soldier's uniform. The conversation that crystallized her feelings happened with Pastor Williams after Sunday service. He congratulated her on completing her training, but then suggested that she had probably learned everything she needed to know and could now settle back into civilian life with new confidence. His assumption that her military service was essentially a self-improvement course rather than a genuine calling revealed how little anyone understood about who she was becoming. Sarah's response surprised everyone, including herself. She announced that she had volunteered for deployment to Afghanistan. The silence that followed was deafening. Her mother's face went white, and several people actually gasped audibly. The community that had been prepared to welcome back their transformed daughter was completely unprepared for the reality that she intended to put her new skills to use in actual combat. The arguments began immediately. Family members reminded her that she had already proven herself and didn't need to take additional risks. Friends pointed out that she could serve in the reserves without deploying to dangerous locations. Even people who barely knew her felt entitled to express opinions about her decision, as if her choice to serve in a war zone was somehow a rejection of their community values. But Sarah's time in basic training had taught her something crucial about herself. She was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The skills she had developed and the confidence she had gained weren't meant to be filed away and forgotten. They were tools meant to be used in service of something larger than her comfortable small-town existence. The weeks leading up to deployment were filled with tension. Sarah went through pre-deployment training, learning specialized skills that would be needed in a combat environment. She studied the culture and language of Afghanistan, memorized maps of the region where she would be stationed, and prepared mentally for the reality of operating in a war zone. Her fellow soldiers preparing for deployment came from diverse backgrounds, but they shared a common understanding of the seriousness of their mission. Unlike her hometown, which seemed to view her deployment as either unnecessary heroics or reckless adventure-seeking, her military colleagues understood that she was simply doing the job she had trained for. The night before leaving for Afghanistan, Sarah sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by reminders of the person she used to be. Her old books, photos from college, mementos from her previous life as a librarian. She felt like an archaeologist examining artifacts from a civilization she had once belonged to, but no longer fully understood. Her phone rang constantly with last-minute calls from family and friends, most of whom were still hoping she would change her mind. The conversations were painful because they revealed how little faith people had in her judgment and capabilities. They saw her deployment as evidence that she had lost touch with reality, rather than recognition that she had found her true calling. Sarah's final conversation was with her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had watched her grow up. Instead of trying to talk her out of leaving, the older woman simply said that she had always sensed there was something special about Sarah that was waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Her words were the first acknowledgement Sarah had received that her transformation might have been inevitable rather than accidental. As she packed her deployment gear, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed. The woman who had once been defined by her predictability and safety was about to board a plane for one of the most dangerous places on Earth. She felt nervous but not afraid, uncertain but not doubtful. Whatever happened next, she was finally becoming the person she was meant to be. Afghanistan was nothing like the training simulations. The heat was oppressive, the dust got into everything, and the constant tension of operating in a hostile environment tested every skill Sarah had learned. Forward Operating Base Kandahar became her new world, a place where the comfortable assumptions of civilian life had no meaning, and survival depended on vigilance, teamwork, and adaptability. Sarah was assigned to an intelligence unit responsible for analyzing communications intercepts and coordinating with local Afghan forces. Her background in research and information organization proved invaluable in a role that required processing vast amounts of data and identifying patterns that others might miss. The skills that had made her an excellent librarian translated surprisingly well to military intelligence work. The unit she joined was led by Captain Rodriguez, a career officer who had already completed 2 previous deployments. He was initially skeptical of Sarah, not because of her gender but because of her obvious newness to military life. Combat veterans develop an instinct about who they can depend on in dangerous situations, and Sarah had yet to prove herself under real pressure. Her first few weeks were spent learning the rhythms of deployment life. The base operated on constant alert, with incoming rocket attacks and improvised explosive device threats keeping everyone on edge. Sarah discovered that her tendency toward a methodical preparation served her well in an environment where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. The work itself was more complex than she had anticipated. Intelligence gathering involved building relationships with local informants, analyzing intercepted communications, and synthesizing information from multiple sources to predict enemy movements. Sarah's ability to remain calm under pressure and think analytically made her surprisingly effective at work that required both technical skills and human intuition. Her breakthrough moment came during a complex operation to locate a high-value target who had been planning attacks against coalition forces. Multiple intelligence sources had provided conflicting information about the target's location, and previous attempts to capture him had failed because the intelligence had been either outdated or deliberately misleading. Sarah spent days cross-referencing communications, intercepts with movement patterns and local cultural information. While others focused on the most obvious leads, she noticed subtle inconsistencies in the intelligence that suggested they were being fed false information through channels they had considered secure. Her analysis indicated that the target was using their own intelligence-gathering methods against them. When Sarah presented her findings to Captain Rodriguez, he was initially skeptical. Her theory required accepting that their local sources had been compromised, and that previous operations had failed because they were being manipulated. But her evidence was thorough and logical, based on patterns that became obvious once they were pointed out, but had been invisible before her analysis. The decision to act on Sarah's intelligence was controversial within the unit. Several experienced soldiers questioned whether they should base a dangerous operation on analysis from someone who had never been in combat. But Captain Rodriguez had learned to trust competence over seniority, and Sarah's work had consistently proven accurate in smaller situations. The operation itself was a testament to careful planning and precise execution. Based on Sarah's analysis, the team was able to anticipate the target's movements and position themselves accordingly. Instead of walking into another ambush, they successfully captured one of the region's most wanted insurgent leaders along with valuable intelligence about planned Attacks, the success of the operation established Sarah's reputation within the unit and across the base. Word spread quickly in the close-knit military community about the former librarian, whose analytical skills had cracked a case that had stumped veteran intelligence officers. But for Sarah, the victory was bittersweet because it came with the recognition of just how dangerous their work really was. The captured intelligence revealed plans for a major attack against the base itself. The information was specific enough to be credible but vague enough about timing to keep everyone on high alert. Sarah found herself working 18-hour days, analyzing every piece of new information for clues about when and how the attack might come. The stress of constant vigilance began to wear on everyone. Sleep became irregular and fitful, interrupted by rocket attacks and emergency alerts. Sarah discovered that her calm demeanor, which had served her well in training, was even more valuable in an environment where panic could be fatal. While others might become agitated or reckless under pressure, she remained focused and analytical. 3 weeks after the successful operation, the anticipated attack finally came. It began before dawn with a coordinated assault involving rockets, mortars, and small arms fire from multiple directions. Sarah's intelligence work had prepared the base defenders for the attack, but knowing it was coming and surviving it were two different things. During the 6-hour battle, Sarah found herself in situations she had never imagined when she first decided to join the military. The abstract concepts of courage and duty became concrete realities as she helped coordinate the defense while under direct fire. The woman who had once been afraid to raise her voice in civilian disagreements was now calmly relaying vital information, while explosions shook the building around her. When the attack was finally repelled, Sarah realized that she had crossed another invisible threshold. She was no longer a newcomer or an outsider proving herself. She had become a trusted member of a combat unit, someone whose skills and judgment were valued by experienced soldiers, who had learned to depend on her expertise and reliability under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The attack on the base had been repelled, but the cost was devastating. Sarah watched as helicopters evacuated wounded soldiers, some of whom she had eaten breakfast with just hours earlier. The abstract nature of military service became brutally concrete as she helped load stretchers and tried to comfort soldiers whose injuries would change their lives forever. Among the wounded was Private Johnson, a 19-year-old from Ohio who had joined the Army straight out of high school. Sarah had taken him under her wing when he first arrived at the base, recognizing in him the same uncertainty and determination she had felt during her own early days in the military. Now he lay unconscious with severe injuries that would likely end his military career before it had really begun. Captain Rodriguez gathered the surviving members of the unit for a debriefing that was part tactical analysis and part group therapy. The successful defense of the base had come at a price that left everyone questioning whether the victory was worth the cost. Sarah found herself struggling with emotions she had never experienced: guilt over surviving when others hadn't, anger at an enemy she couldn't see or understand, and a profound sadness that seemed to settle into her bones. The days following the attack were filled with a different kind of tension. The base had held, but everyone knew it was a target and that future attacks were inevitable. Sarah threw herself into her intelligence work with renewed intensity, determined to prevent another surprise assault. She worked through meals and sleep, analyzing every piece of information with the desperate focus of someone who understood that failure meant watching more friends get loaded onto evacuation helicopters. Her obsessive attention to detail revealed something troubling in the intelligence patterns. The attack on their base had been too well coordinated and too precisely timed to be the result of luck or general surveillance. Someone with detailed knowledge of their defenses and routines had provided information to the enemy. The successful operation that had established Sarah's reputation had also exposed them to a security breach. Investigating potential security compromises was delicate work that required Sarah to analyze the communications and movements of people she had come to trust. The possibility that someone within their own forces might be providing information to the enemy was almost too painful to consider, but the evidence was becoming increasingly clear that their security had been compromised from within. Sarah's investigation led her to focus on their local Afghan interpreters and support staff. These were people who had risked their lives to work with coalition forces, often facing death threats from insurgents who viewed them as traitors. But among the genuinely loyal local employees, Sarah's analysis suggested that at least one was providing detailed information about base operations to enemy forces. The discovery that their security breach involved local staff created a moral crisis for Sarah. She had developed relationships with many of the Afghan employees, learning about their families and their hopes for their country's future. The thought that one of them might be responsible for the injuries and deaths of her fellow soldiers was devastating, but the evidence was too clear to ignore. When Sarah presented her findings to Captain Rodriguez, she could see the same conflict in his eyes. Acting on her intelligence would mean implementing security measures that would affect all of the local employees, including many who had proven their loyalty repeatedly. But ignoring the breach would leave the base vulnerable to future attacks that could be even more devastating than the one they had just survived. The decision was made to quietly investigate the suspected individuals while implementing new security protocols that would limit access to sensitive information. Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of observing people she had considered friends, looking for signs of deception or betrayal. The work required her to maintain normal relationships, while constantly analyzing every conversation for potential intelligence gathering. The breakthrough came when Sarah noticed communication patterns that suggested one of the interpreters was asking questions that went beyond his job requirements. His inquiries about guard rotations, supply deliveries, and communication procedures could have been innocent curiosity, but when combined with other evidence, they painted a picture of systematic intelligence gathering for enemy forces. Confronting the suspected individual was one of the most difficult things Sarah had ever done. The interpreter, Ahmad, had worked with their unit for months and had risked his life on numerous occasions to help coalition forces communicate with local populations. He had a wife and children who depended on his income, and his cooperation with American forces had already made him a target for insurgent violence. When presented with the evidence, Ahmad broke down and confessed that he had been coerced into providing information to insurgent forces. His family had been threatened, and he had been forced to choose between betraying the coalition forces he worked with and watching his children be killed. The moral complexity of his situation left Sarah struggling with questions that had no easy answers. The arrest of Ahmad led to the discovery of a broader network of coercion that insurgent forces were using to compromise local employees throughout the region. Sarah's investigation had uncovered not just a security breach at their base, but a systematic campaign to exploit the vulnerabilities of Afghan civilians who were trying to build a better future for their country. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed since arriving in Afghanistan. The woman who had once been paralyzed by simple decisions was now making choices that affected life and death. She had learned to live with moral ambiguity and to accept that sometimes there were no good options, only necessary ones. The ceremony was small and private, held in a dusty courtyard of Forward Operating Base Kandahar as Sarah's deployment came to an end. Captain Rodriguez stood before the assembled unit, holding a folded American flag that had flown over the base during some of its most challenging months. This wasn't just any flag, but one that had witnessed the courage and sacrifice of soldiers who had defended their position against overwhelming odds. Sarah stood at attention as Rodriguez spoke about her contributions to the unit's success. Her intelligence work had prevented multiple attacks, saved countless lives, and helped capture high-value targets that had been operating with impunity for months. But more than her technical skills, he praised her character under pressure and her ability to make difficult decisions when the stakes were highest. The flag being presented to Sarah carried special significance. It had been flying during the attack that had caused so many casualties, including Private Johnson, who had died from his injuries 3 weeks after the assault. The flag had also flown during the successful operations that had disrupted enemy networks and protected not just their base, but surrounding communities from planned terrorist attacks. As Rodriguez placed the flag in Sarah's hands, she felt the weight of everything it represented. This wasn't just a symbol of her service, but a tangible connection to the soldiers who hadn't made it home, the local civilians who had risked everything to help coalition forces, and the complex reality of a war that defied simple explanations or easy victories. The flight home from Afghanistan gave Sarah hours to process everything that had happened during her deployment. She carried with her not just the flag, but also letters from the families of soldiers whose lives her work had saved, photographs of local children who had benefited from humanitarian missions her intelligence had made possible, and the memories of friends she had lost along the way. The woman returning to Texas was fundamentally different from the one who had left. Sarah had discovered reserves of strength and capability that she never could have imagined when she first walked into that Army recruitment office. She had learned to make life and death decisions under pressure, to lead others in crisis situations, and to carry the weight of responsibility that came with protecting people who depended on her expertise. When Sarah's plane landed at the military airfield, she was surprised to find a small crowd waiting for her. Word of her service had somehow reached her hometown, though the details had been filtered through military security requirements and small-town rumor mills. The story that had emerged was incomplete but powerful. Their quiet librarian had become a decorated intelligence specialist whose work had saved American lives in a war zone. The homecoming was awkward and emotional. Sarah's mother cried as she hugged her daughter, overwhelmed by relief that she had returned safely and pride in what she had accomplished. But there was also an underlying tension from family members who struggled to reconcile the Sarah they remembered with the confident, capable woman who had returned carrying a flag she had earned through service they couldn't fully understand. At the community welcome home gathering, Sarah found herself surrounded by the same people who had doubted her decision to join the military. Their attitude now was completely different, filled with respect and admiration for her service. But their praise felt hollow because it was based on results rather than understanding. They celebrated her success without grasping the cost or complexity of what she had experienced. The local newspaper wanted to interview Sarah about her service, but she struggled to find words that would convey the reality of her deployment without violating security requirements or exploiting the sacrifice of others. How could she explain that her greatest accomplishment might have been learning to live with moral ambiguity? How could she describe the weight of making decisions that affected whether people lived or died? During a quiet moment at the gathering, Sarah stepped outside to escape the crowd and found herself alone with the folded flag. She thought about Ahmad, the interpreter whose betrayal had been forced by threats against his family. She remembered Private Johnson's laugh and his plans to study engineering when his deployment ended. She reflected on Captain Rodriguez's trust in her judgment and the weight of responsibility that trust had carried. Pastor Williams approached her in the parking lot, no longer treating her like the uncertain woman who had left town months earlier. He asked about her plans now that she was home, clearly expecting her to settle back into civilian life with perhaps occasional reserve duties. His assumption that her military service was finished revealed how little even her supporters understood about who she had become. Sarah's response surprised him. She explained that she was considering making the military her career, possibly pursuing officer training or specialized intelligence work. The idea that she might choose to remain in an environment that had transformed her so completely was something her hometown couldn't quite grasp. They wanted to celebrate her service, but they also wanted her to return to being the person they remembered. The flag in Sarah's hands represented more than personal achievement. It carried the weight of responsibility to honor those who hadn't returned home, to continue serving in ways that made their sacrifice meaningful. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. She had discovered that strength didn't always come from physical capability, but from the determination to do what was necessary when others were counting on you. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The simple woman they had once dismissed had proven capable of extraordinary things, not because she had changed into someone else, but because she had finally discovered who she had always been capable of becoming. Standing in the parking lot of her hometown community center, holding a flag that represented months of danger, loss, and growth, Sarah realized that her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The woman who had left as a quiet librarian seeking to prove herself had returned as a proven leader who understood her own capabilities and responsibilities. The flag would be displayed in her home, but its true significance would be carried in her heart. It represented not just her service in Afghanistan, but the journey from being underestimated to becoming someone others could depend on in the most challenging circumstances. It was proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they found the courage to step beyond the limitations that others placed on them. Sarah looked up at the Texas stars, thinking about the soldiers still serving in places like Afghanistan, the local interpreters still risking their lives to build a better future for their country, and the families of those who had paid the ultimate price for freedom. The flag in her hands connected her to all of them, and to the responsibility to continue serving in whatever way would honor their sacrifice and make the world a little bit safer for the next generation. The simple woman they had once known was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from being the biggest or loudest person in the room, but from being reliable when others needed you most. As Sarah walked toward her car, flag tucked carefully under her arm, she carried with her the knowledge that she had found her true calling, and the confidence to pursue it, wherever it might lead.